From the outside looking in, it can sometimes appear that peak performers have an elusive talent or skill that sets them apart from the rest of us. However, what usually sets peak performers apart isn't what they can do, it's what they will do. You are listening to the Trading Edges Podcast, the podcast dedicated to seeking and sharing the best ideas and principles from peak performers across all domains of performance and achievement to help you discover your full trading potential.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Houston, and welcome to episode 28 of Trading Edges. Now, this podcast is a bit of a change. It's actually an audio essay, and if you want to read the full written version of the essay, head on over to the blog at thetradingedge.org/episode 28. So, this podcast is titled Abandon the Average and Embrace Your Edges. And let me begin with a quote to kind of kick things off. All of us want to be normal, yet none of us want to be average. Beautiful quote. Several months back, I finished reading The End of Average by Harvard's Todd Rose, which now sits on my top recommended books list. And let me just say, if you're a student of studying talent, like I am, then this is really a must read. It's greatly influenced my thinking, and his work could probably be the launch pad to a massive change in how we understand education, personal development, hiring, and just the evaluation of individual performance, and of course the performance of employees and personnel. Todd Rose and his colleagues over at Harvard are really at the leading edge of a new science, the science called the science of the individual, which is a multidisciplinary field drawing upon recent scientific and mathematical findings to demonstrate that it's simply not possible to draw meaningful conclusions about human beings using statistical averages. Surprise, surprise. In The End of Average, Todd Rose's book, he provokes us to see how for the past century we've all been part of a large-scale series of social experiments conducted by just a handful of social scientists who thought they could correctly identify how groups of people behave and perform based on averages. And it turns out they were wrong. And you, me, and everyone else who's been through our quote-unquote factorized educational system or who's worked in corporate America has probably been touched by this massive and cultural bias. So, how did we become so addicted to averages? Well, as Rose says, for more than a century now, this sort of average size fits all model has ignored our individuality and failed to recognize talent. And this is kind of where it all started. Our culture is built around averageness. And it's an idea that was first introduced in the early 19th century by Adolphe Quetelet, a Belgian astronomer and a statistician. Now, Quetelet was trying to measure planetary speed. And at that time, he came up with the novel idea to find the average of variable kind of astronomical observations in the belief that that average would be the most accurate result. So astronomers thought that the average of all these data points they would collect was probably the closest thing to the correct speed, and that the deviation from said average was the error. And this idea of average being perfect, it took hold. Average became the sought after perfection, and everything else, well, it became deviation. Now, averages may be all well and good for the natural laws of physics, but here's where the problem started. Quetelet then took it a step further and began to apply the concept of averagism to human beings. and invented the then novel idea of quote-unquote the average man in 1835. That is, he took a number of attributes like physical and intellectual measures, then proceeded to use the mean of these values to create this average man. Again, everyone outside of the average or that normal distribution was considered to be deviation. And so began our obsession with the average. Then and now, we live in a world filled of averages and are constantly rated against these averages. Just take a look around. Think of IQ, right? Average IQ, GPA, average income, BMI or body mass index, average weight, percentage of body fat, average lifespan, number of years in school. These are all averages, and all of us are constantly rated against these averages. Now, fast forward to the 1940s, and researchers at the Air Force were gathering data on thousands of would-be pilots and measuring them across these 10 distinct anatomical dimensions in the hope of finding the best cockpit design for their fighter jets, and then recruiting the pilots who measured up to fit in them. At the same time, coincidentally, the search was on to find female perfection. This doctor named Robert Dickinson, who was at that time the chief of obstetrics and gynecology, and his collaborators at the Brooklyn Hospital were taking physical measurements of 15,000 young adult women and created a sculpture called, out of all things, Norma, that can now be seen in the Cleveland Health Museum. The trouble was that almost none of the pilots and none of the young women who were actually measured for these experiments actually matched the average ideal. That is, there was just too much individual variation. So here's the thing. We need to realize that there's no such thing as an average human, and we need to stop measuring ourselves according to arbitrary yardsticks with no real basis in human nature, says Rose. At this point, you'll be asking, well, what's the big deal about using averages? Now, averages are very useful. However, there's a common drawback when you appeal to or design to the lowest common denominator. And it turns out when you design for everybody, you design for nobody, which is a very famous design quote. By designing the cockpit of a jet fighter for the average man, they were designing jets for nobody, says Rose of the Air Force's experiment. And the Air Force actually responded by abandoning this idea of trying to design to the average, that is, to the average physical stature, demanding instead that the manufacturers of these jet planes, these jet fighters, instead design to the edges, i.e., that they need to be adjustable for extremes of size, fitting both the tallest and the shortest, and those of the widest and narrowest chests. And this led to innovations we now take for granted, such as the adjustable seat. That's kind of the genesis of that commonplace thing we have in our cars and everywhere else nowadays. Again, design to the average may not be a big deal if we're talking about mass market goods like socks or apparel. Most of us are, after all, probably willing to trade a bit of fit and comfort for a reduced price in the convenience of just going anywhere and being able to pick up a pair of socks or a t-shirt. But what if we're talking about something like education? And in Rose's mind, averages have failed us spectacularly, especially in our educational institutions. See, we may not all need to fit into a fighter cockpit, but we all have had to at some point fit into a classroom, he says. And we have yet to see this equivalent of adjustable seating within education or various other equivalent endeavors. See, the educational system we have nowadays is still in large part the same system we've had since the Industrial Revolution. It was a system designed to churn out average workers who would fit like cogs into assembly line companies. So I think now we can all agree that broad conclusions say almost nothing about individual experience and capabilities. And intuitively, we know this to be true, right? Yet the appeal of the average has become a widespread cultural blind spot. So, I've given you now a broad swath of some of Rose's big ideas and kind of the science of the individual. So let me relate some of this to trading. And Rose shares 3 principles to help us end our obsession with average. So let me share with you these 3 principles and how we can apply them to trading. First off, the 3 principles are: number 1, jaggedness; number 2, context; and number 3, pathway. Let me say it again. There are 3 principles: the principle of jaggedness, the principle of context, and the pathway principle. Let's first begin with jaggedness. The key idea here is that oversimplifying leaves out necessary complexity, because average is one smooth number derived from varying jagged data points. And by emphasizing and valuing jaggedness, this actually restores the accuracy of an individual signature. As an example, in Rose's book, there's a graphic that shows a tall thin man, and a short, stout man. Now, both men weigh the same, but that's all you can say about that. Hence, average weight is actually oversimplification. And in turn, simplicity, in many ways, is the enemy of accuracy. Think about how this relates to trading for a moment. Each of us, each individual, is better adapted at some things and not to others. That is, each of us brings different data points to trading. Think of some of your own pertinent attributes that relate to trading. Some are cognitive, some are skill, some are knowledge-based. I'll give you a sample. There's maybe working memory, processing speed, attentional control, technical, fundamental knowledge, chart reading, curiosity, intuition, emotional resilience, innate interest, maybe even some of your preferences and beliefs. All of these form a composite of our individual jagged signature. So here's the takeaway. If your goal is to become a great trader, there's no such thing as an average great trader. I say that again. If your goal is to become a great trader, there's no such thing as an average great trader. Because each trader has a jagged sized profile. That is, each trader varies on dimensions of learning, skill, and understanding. Because even geniuses have strengths and weaknesses. Hence, the way you develop as a trader is through cultivating strong awareness and having a strong self-assessment of your unique skills and their strengths and weaknesses. And through this awareness, you can cut through the average and instead embrace your jaggedness and be willing to confront your true self, warts and all. So I see a lot of people tempted to try to emulate other traders. You cannot be Paul Tudor Jones. You can't be Warren Buffett, because I'm sure they have a hard enough time being themselves. The reality is that you can only be you. So let me leave you with a question. What is it that makes you uniquely you? And make that question your orientation. Now, the second principle is the context principle. Trait theorists and those who are believers of personality typing tend to believe we're either, for instance, introverts or extroverts. We've all heard that debate. But humans aren't fixed entities, nor are we simple average abstractions. And personality typing, such as, Myers-Briggs, the type indicator, and the Enneagram, they don't take situational variability into account. And trait theory has really come under a lot of criticism nowadays for many reasons, including its poor track record at predicting individual behavior and for its inability to actually account for why people act the way they do. For instance, let's take the issue of trader discipline. We've all heard the often quoted importance of being, quote unquote, a disciplined trader. But what does that even mean, right? How does one even begin to address the behavior of being disciplined? It doesn't. Because that's like telling an alcoholic not to drink so much, right? What's important in understanding and actually changing behavior is to understand under what context this behavior expresses itself. See, the same trader who fails to take stops in a disciplined manner may be the same trader who wakes up early at 5 a.m. each morning to go for a 10-kilometer run in sun, rain, or snow 5 days a week. So who's to say this trader isn't disciplined? What's probably more accurate to say is that personalities aren't consistent, and we're influenced by situations we find ourselves in, i.e. context. That is, each person has a unique set of behavioral if-then signatures which are more meaningful than any kind of overarching characterization. So the takeaway is to stop falling in the trap of labeling yourself this or that. The reality is that you have a certain set of traits that show up based upon the context. And again, the key is to begin to apply awareness to your traits and behaviors. For instance, you may generally be a disciplined trader. However, you may find yourself acting out of character based upon a certain trigger. Perhaps this occurs when you've had a set of losses, or maybe you get low-ticked and that you let your mounting frustration get the best of you. Under this context, you move or you remove your well-planned stop. So, the practice then is to begin to build a list of if-then signatures so that you can better understand how you behave and, more importantly, how you want to behave in these specific circumstances. Don't fall back on labels and averages. The final principle is the pathway principle. There really is no single road to trading success. And while some occupations demand a rigid pathway, not all do, especially not trading. Given basically the low barrier to entry, one basically only needs to fund a brokerage account to become a quote-unquote trader. You don't even need to pass an examination, right? So what we see is a wide range of backgrounds and personalities that show up to trading. And it always irks me when I see sort of one-dimensional and dogmatic thinkers who see only one right path to trading success. The truth is, it's a lot more layered. There are multiple pathways, multiple webs one can take to become successful in trading. For some, this may involve reading books, taking courses, hiring coaches, finding mentors, trying different strategies, different instruments, different time frames, etc., etc. However, unlike traditional schooling, where success means clocking in seat time and not failing required courses, trading requires that one successfully embody a set of skills and mindsets. And the length of time to embody these skills and mindsets can take anywhere between maybe 2 years to 10 years. And some would argue that it never ends if you're searching for true mastery. So, given the uniqueness that each of us brings to the table, this is why I always call learning to trade or trading a journey. Because each person has to find their own path towards consistently extracting capital out of the markets. Now, if there's one shortcut or one time-tested pathway I can leave with you, is to seek guidance from people who have been in your shoes. There